The air was thick with dust, the kind that clung to your skin and seeped into your lungs. Gunfire cracked in sharp bursts, echoing off the jagged hills of Kandahar's outskirts. Sergeant David Lawson crouched low behind a crumbling wall, the weight of his medical pack digging into his shoulders. He could taste copper in his mouth, whether from the dry air or the tension he didn't know. His hands were steady, but his mind was a storm. A shout came from somewhere to his left. "Medic, we've got one down." He moved without hesitation, weaving through the chaos. The ground trembled under the concussive force of mortars, and every instinct screamed at him to stay low. Ahead, a young private lay clutching his thigh, crimson staining his fatigues. David dropped to his knees, his hands already working to clamp the bleeding. Then, in the periphery of smoke and noise, he saw her. She stood about 20 yards away, untouched by the dust and debris. A woman draped in simple robes, her face serene, her arms cradling a small child wrapped in white cloth. The infant's cry was soft but distinct, impossibly clear amid the chaos. Her gaze met his, not with urgency, but with a calm so profound it froze him in place. "Lawson!" Mac's voice snapped him back. "Focus, man!" David blinked, and the woman was gone. The desert was just the desert again, barren, hostile, and loud. He finished stabilizing the private and waved for evacuation. But his mind wasn't on the injury. It was on what he'd seen. Before we go deeper into this extraordinary true story, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss moments like this. Moments that challenge everything you think you know about life, faith, and survival. David Lawson wasn't a man prone to visions. Born and raised in a modest Texas town, his upbringing was more about ranch chores and Friday night football than spiritual revelations. His father, a Vietnam veteran, spoke little of war, and his mother, a schoolteacher, filled the home with quiet faith but never forced it. The September morning when the Twin Towers fell, David was 19. He'd been sipping burnt coffee in the diner off Main Street when the news broke. By the next week, he was standing in a recruitment office signing papers that would send him far from home. He trained hard, learned quickly, and found his place as a combat medic, a role that demanded precision under pressure and the ability to see people as more than soldiers in uniform. Years later, deployments had worn grooves into his soul. He'd patched up countless wounds, some visible, others buried too deep for gauze and sutures. Afghanistan was unforgiving, but he had learned to operate in its rhythm, until the day Mary appeared. The rest of that afternoon blurred into muscle memory, checking vitals, directing stretchers, listening for the whistle of incoming fire. But the image stayed with him, vivid and immovable. He didn't mention it to anyone, not yet. In the military, the wrong kind of story could get you pulled from the field, and he wasn't ready to explain something he didn't understand himself. That night, in the dim light of the outpost tent, Mac sat across from him, tearing into an MRE with his usual lack of ceremony. "You were out of it for a second today," he said, not looking up. "Something on your mind?" David hesitated. "Just saw something strange." Mac raised an eyebrow. "Strange how? Like enemy movement or—" "Not that kind of strange," David cut in. "Forget it." Mac shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just keep your head in the game. Out here, drifting gets you killed." David lay awake long after lights out, the image of the woman replaying in his mind, the way she'd stood there unshaken, as if the war around her meant nothing, the crying child in her arms, the stillness in her eyes. He didn't know why, but deep down, he felt that the battlefield and his life had just shifted, and whatever it meant, he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The weeks before the firefight moved in a slow, grinding rhythm that wore grooves into the day. At the forward operating base, mornings began with the metallic scrape of the Chow Hall line and ended with the dull ache of shoulders under armor. David checked his gear like a ritual. Tourniquets, gauze, IVs, trauma shears, morphine, a notebook he barely wrote in anymore. The sun rose mean and unblinking, bleaching the sky to a hard white that swallowed shadows. Dust found its way into everything: zippers, boots, prayer books, even sealed field dressings. Mac called it the world's longest sandpaper scrape. You just keep bracing and hoping it ends, he'd say, tearing open an MRE as if it had wronged him. He was from Detroit, stubborn about the Lions, and fiercely loyal to the few people he trusted. He made David drink water, cracked jokes when no one asked, and knew exactly when to shut up. Lieutenant Sarah Miller ran the platoon like a quiet metronome. She enforced rest cycles, made the rounds in the motor pool, and kept an eye on anyone who started talking too fast or not at all. "We're not machines," she'd remind them. "We're people with limits. Respect them." Some rolled their eyes. Most listened, because she had the habit of being right. The outside world pressed in through the wire. Local kids kicked a threadbare soccer ball along the dusty road and waved at the convoy like it was a parade. Shopkeepers at the bazaar haggled in a mix of Pashto, Dari and English, grinning as they sold radio batteries, tea and cheap sunglasses. Farid, their interpreter, warned them gently about routes to avoid, tribal tensions, and rumors that washed through villages like sudden rain. David listened more than he spoke. At night, when the diesel generators droned and the wind worried the canvas, he lay on his cot counting breaths. The chapel tent sat near the laundry shack, a plain space with a wooden cross and a stack of dog-eared hymnals. He went sometimes, not always, offering up the same blunt prayer. "Keep them alive. Keep me useful. If you're there, don't let me freeze when it matters." Letters from home came in waves. His mother wrote about her second-grade class and the bluebonnets starting to bloom along the Texas highway. His father's notes were shorter. Facts, weather, football scores, a quiet pride he couldn't quite put into sentences. David kept the letters in a Ziploc bag, safe from dust and sweat, and read them on slow Sundays, when the heat pressed down and time felt like it had stopped. The obstacles were simple to list and hard to carry. Sleep came in fragments. Water tasted like plastic. Everyone's temper ran short. The route clearance team missed things sometimes, and the possibility of a buried charge lurked beneath every innocent patch of earth. Rules of engagement were necessary and confining, and each hesitation felt like a gamble. The worst was uncertainty, the long wait for the next hour to reveal whether it was ordinary or lethal. Farid once invited them to tea in a shaded courtyard behind a mechanic's stall. Steam rose from tiny cups, and the mint cut through the dust like rain after drought. An elder talked with Sarah about school supplies for the village. Mac traded stories with a boy who insisted his uncle could fix anything at all. David listened to the cadence of voices he barely understood and felt a quiet thread of shared human ordinariness. That night he dreamed of the Gulf back home, waves ticking against the pylons of the pier at Galveston. In the dream, a woman walked along the waterline, but he never saw her face. He woke with the taste of salt in his mouth and a feeling like a note sustained on a guitar string, faint, vibrating, impossible to ignore. He told himself it was homesickness and drank from his canteen until the taste faded. Morning came hot, ordinary, and unmerciful again. The morning started with the dry hiss of wind dragging dust across the compound. Patrol orders came down fast, convoy to resupply a remote checkpoint near Kandahar's southern edge. David checked his gear twice, then a third time, the old habit of someone who knew exactly how fast things could go wrong. Mac grumbled about the heat before they'd even rolled out. Sarah briefed the team with clipped precision, and Farid climbed into the last Humvee, his eyes scanning the horizon even before the gate swung open. The road out was a ribbon of pale dirt bordered by scrub and low stone walls. David sat behind the gunner, watching the shifting mirages blur the distance. Say it felt like any other run, same thrum of the engine, same grit on the teeth, until the air changed. It was a subtle thing, the way quiet stretched too long between bursts of static on the radio, the way even the goats in the fields seemed to vanish. The first shot cracked from the ridgeline. The gunner returned fire and the convoy jerked to a halt. More rounds raked the side of the lead vehicle, shattering mirrors, punching holes through metal. Contact front," someone shouted over comms. David was moving before the call ended. He grabbed his pack, leapt from the vehicle, and crouched behind a half-collapsed wall. The heat felt heavier, the air sharper. Through the smoke from the returning fire, he could make out figures moving along the ridge, rifles spitting sparks. A scream to his left. Private Torres was down, leg torn open by shrapnel. David slid across the dirt, heart slamming against his ribs. "You're good, stay with me," he said, voice steady as his hands worked. He packed the wound, cinched the tourniquet, barely noticing the gunfire stitching the dirt a few feet away. Then he saw her. She stood not 20 yards ahead, beyond the churn of smoke and dust. A woman in robes of a muted blue, fabric shifting gently in air that should have been scorched and wild. In her arms, a child wrapped in white, its tiny face turned toward him, crying softly. The sound threaded through the noise, clear, unwavering, impossible. David froze. The battlefield around her moved in its chaos, bullets slicing the air, debris scattering, but nothing touched her. The light on her face was different, not the hard glare of the Afghan sun, but something warmer, almost tender. "Lawson!" Mac's voice tore through the moment. "Get down!" David blinked. She was gone. The space she'd stood in was just churned dirt and heat shimmer. He dragged Torres to cover as Mac laid down, suppressing fire. The minutes stretched into an unsteady blur, Sarah shouting orders, Fareed relaying positions, the smell of hot metal and cordite thick enough to taste. An RPG screamed overhead and detonated behind them, the shockwave kicking dust into their teeth and ears. "Medic!" another voice yelled. Specialist Harris this time, bleeding from a graze along his arm. David worked on him quickly, then was pulled toward another soldier clutching his side. Every movement was automatic, every action a drilled reflex. But behind it all, the image burned. The calm face, the crying child, the way the world seemed to bend around her. Finally, the firefight thinned. The insurgents melted back into the hills as quickly as they had appeared. Engines roared to life again, and the convoy limped forward, battered but intact. In the back of the Humvee, David sat with Torres, keeping pressure on the wound. Mac leaned against the opposite wall, sweat carving streaks through the dust on his face. "You froze for a second back there," Mac said, voice low, not accusing. "Just saw something," David replied. "Something?" David shook his head. "Doesn't matter." Mac didn't push, just reached for his canteen and took a long drink. Outside, the desert rolled by, empty and endless. David kept his eyes forward, but the truth was he couldn't stop seeing her, standing untouched in the storm of war, looking straight at him as if she knew exactly why she was there. The crew chief nodded, slid the litter into place, and the bird lifted in a storm of grit that tasted like metal. For a moment the battlefield noise receded, leaving only the ringing in his ears and the hollow thud of his pulse. The convoy limped through the gate, armor rattling, paint scored with fresh scars. In the aid station, the air smelled of antiseptic, diesel, and sweat. David moved station to station, gloving up, stripping bloodied sleeves, taping gauze, replacing fluids. Harris cracked a joke as David irrigated the graze on his arm, the laugh brittle but stubborn. "You gonna charge me extra for the luxury wash?" "Only if you want conditioner," David said, and the crack of humor steadied the room for a beat. Sarah came in with her notebook, checking names against injuries. Torres airborne, stable en route. Harris, light duty. Bennett, concussion protocol. "Lawson, you good?" "I'm good," he answered automatically, even as his hands twitched with leftover adrenaline. He felt a tremor running through his forearms, like a current he couldn't ground. When the last bandage was taped and the last form signed, he stepped outside. The late afternoon sun hung harsh and white over the wall. Somewhere, a generator coughed. Fareed offered him a bottle of water and a quiet nod. David drank, swallowing past a throat that felt lined with sandpaper, and stared at nothing. He told himself to breathe like he taught others to breathe, slow, in fours, out in sixes. The image slid back in, uninvited and complete. The woman in the muted blue, the child wrapped in white, the crying that cut clean through gunfire. It felt less like a memory and more like something still unfolding, as if he only had one corner of it, and the rest stretched beyond his sight. Mac found him by the HESCO barriers, slumping down beside him with a grunt. "You look like you hugged a Humvee." "Feels like it," David said. They sat a while, backs to the wall, letting the silence cool. Finally, Mac spoke. You froze for a blink today. Not long. Just long enough for me to notice. I saw something, David said. The words were thin and heavy all at once. Mac looked sideways. Enemy movement? A woman, David said, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. Holding a baby. Right there in the fire, nobody touching her, like she was made of air and light at the same time. Mac rubbed his jaw, eyes narrowing, but not in judgment. Heat messes with you. Dehydration, smoke, adrenaline. Brains do weird things when they're trying to keep you alive. I know the textbook, David said. This wasn't a mirage. Mac cracked his knuckles, thinking, you tell Sarah that, she's obliged to get medical involved, which might be good. Or it might park you in evaluation where your hands can't help anyone for a while. I'm not saying lie, I'm saying decide what you need right now. David stared at the dirt. What I need is to not see it every time I blink. Mac nodded. Then talk to me, or the chaplain, or write it down and burn the paper. Just don't let it sit there and grow teeth. The sun slid a little lower. Chow time drifted across the compound as a rumor, metal trays, and the smell of something pretending to be chicken. Sarah walked by, paused. Brief in 20, after action and route review. They filed into the ops tent. Maps hung with colored grease pencil lines. Radios muttered. Sarah led the debrief with her careful cadence. What went right, what they'd tighten next time. David reported injuries, interventions, times, drug dosages. His voice was clinical, factual. Inside, another voice kept repeating the same quiet detail. The way the child's cry did not belong to that place. Afterward, he scrubbed his hands at the wash station until the dust and blood gave way to raw skin. He took the long way to the barracks, passing the chapel tent. The flap was open. The cross looked plain and wooden, nothing dramatic about it. He stood there longer than he meant to, listening to the canvas breathe. In the barracks, he wrote a single line in the notebook he never used. I saw her. He closed it, slid it under his pillow, and lay back. Sleep came in ragged inches. Every time he drifted, he returned to the same impossible stillness in the middle of chaos, and the same unanswered question that waited for him like a post on the next day's route. The nights that followed stretched long and uneven, stitched together by the hum of generators and the far-off crackle of gunfire. Sleep came in thin sheets, never covering him fully. When it did, it carried him back, not to firefights or training fields, but to the blue of her robes, the weightless quiet around her, the child's soft cry. The memory was sharper than any dream he'd had before, and yet impossible to prove to anyone else. David found himself running on muscle memory. Morning checks, gear inspections, patrol rotations. He'd catch himself staring at the horizon too long, expecting something to form out of the shimmer. In the medic's tent, he worked without pause, his hands steady, but his mind caught between duty and the shadow of that moment. Mac noticed. You're running quieter than usual, he said one afternoon, tossing a pack of powdered sports drink into David's lap. Just tired, David said, though fatigue didn't explain the restlessness that had lodged itself behind his ribs. That evening, the mail run brought a letter from home. His mother's handwriting spilled across the page in neat, looping lines. The second graders she taught were learning about constellations, his sister's new job at the feed store, the church ladies organizing a bake sale. At the end, she'd written, I pray for you every night. I know God hears. He read the last line 3 times, the words pressing on him like a warm hand he couldn't see. The next morning, after chow, he crossed paths with Lieutenant Miller in the motor pool. She was checking a tire on one of the Humvees, grease on her knuckles. You've been somewhere else lately, she said without looking up. Just keeping pace, he replied. Keeping pace doesn't mean carrying everything by yourself, she said, meeting his eyes now. You've been in this job long enough to know when something's chewing on you. David thought of telling her, of describing the vision in every detail, but the image of being pulled from the line and sent back for evaluation stopped him cold. I'm fine, he said instead, Her look said she didn't believe him, but she didn't press. That night in the mess hall, the conversation turned to strange things people had seen downrange. Ghost stories, odd lights, shapes that weren't there on second glance. Harris swore he'd seen a shadow move against the wind. Bennett claimed he'd heard singing in a burned-out school. The others laughed it off, swapping tales until the talk drifted elsewhere. David stayed quiet, but his chest tightened with the urge to speak. Later, outside under a sky scraped clean by desert wind, Mac lit a cigarette and handed him one. David didn't smoke, but he held it between his fingers anyway, the small orange ember marking the darkness. "What if," David began, then stopped. "What if what? What if you saw something you can't explain and it doesn't fit into the world the way you know it?" Mac took a drag, exhaled slow. "Then you figure out if it's meant to be explained or just carried. Some things aren't puzzles. They're weights you get stronger under." The words settled between them, heavy and oddly steadying. Back in his bunk, David tried to write more in the notebook, details, feelings, anything that might make sense of it, but the pen hovered useless over the page. All he managed was the shape of the robe, the sound of the child, the calm in her eyes. He closed it again, frustrated at how small the words felt against what he'd seen. The following day brought another patrol. The road unspooled ahead, the air baking, the Humvee's suspension jarring every bone. David kept his eyes moving, scanning not just for threats but for something he couldn't name. The emptiness ahead was both relief and disappointment. The vision hadn't left him. It had taken root. And with each mile, each hour, the question grew sharper. Was it madness or was it someone calling him? The blast had torn through the market without warning. One moment, David and his team were unloading crates of bottled water and medical supplies from the back of a Humvee. The next, a wave of heat and sound slammed into him, knocking the breath from his chest. The air filled with shouts in 2 languages, smoke curling into the sky, and the metallic tang of blood already cutting through the dust. He was moving before thought caught up. Training overrode shock, tourniquets, pressure dressings, triage. A child sobbed nearby, his arm scraped raw. David knelt, checked him for deeper injuries, then passed him to a local volunteer. Farid translated rapidly between English and Pashto, his voice strained but steady. Sarah directed the soldiers to secure the perimeter, while Mac helped David carry a man with a head wound to the shaded awning of a shop. The man's wife followed, her face pale under streaks of soot. David knelt, checked pupils, and began wrapping the wound, his hands moving in practiced rhythm. It wasn't until the worst of the wounded were stabilized that David noticed her, Amina. She was standing at the edge of the wreckage, her long scarf fluttering in the wind, holding a small boy no older than 3. The child was silent, his wide eyes fixed on the ruins of the fruit stand that had once stood near the blast. Farid introduced them when Amina stepped forward, offering bottles of water from a woven basket slung over her shoulder. "She wants to help," Farid said. "She says she knows what it is to survive when you shouldn't have." David took the water, passing it to Mac to distribute, then asked, "Was she here when it happened?" Farid translated. Amina shook her head slowly, then spoke in a tone that made Farid pause before relaying her words. "She says there was a day long ago during the fighting here. She saw a woman in blue robes holding a child. Bullets passed her by as if they could not see her. She says the woman looked at her and she felt peace. Not safety. Peace." David's chest tightened. "Did she tell you what the woman looked like?" Farid asked. Amina answered without hesitation. Farid's eyes flickered when he translated. "She says the woman's eyes were calm, as if she had seen every grief the world could give and still loved it." For a moment the sounds of the market, hammering boards, shifting rubble, murmured voices, faded into a background hum. David didn't speak. He couldn't. Amina pressed a bottle of water into his hand and met his gaze with a steady, knowing look, as if recognizing something in him. Then she turned to comfort the boy in her arms, speaking to him softly in words David didn't understand, but somehow felt. Mac sidled up beside him. "What's that look on your face?" "Nothing," David said too quickly. "Uh-huh." Mac didn't push, just followed him back toward the supply truck. By dusk, the market was quieter. Soldiers had helped clear debris, locals had reclaimed what they could, and the wounded were either on their way to hospitals or in the care of family. As David packed the last of his gear, he caught sight of Amina again, standing at the edge of the road with the boy. She lifted her hand, not in a wave but in a small deliberate gesture of acknowledgement. On the ride back, the Humvee jolting over potholes, David stared at the desert beyond the window. The wind pushed waves across the sand, and he thought of her words. Peace, not safety. It was exactly what he'd felt that day on the battlefield, and hearing it from someone else only deepened the knot of questions tightening inside him. That night he opened his notebook again. For the first time since writing I Saw Her, he added another line. I am not the only one. The heat that morning felt heavier, like the air itself was warning them. The convoy was headed to deliver medical equipment to a remote aid station, nothing unusual on paper, but everyone was on edge. Even Mac's usual pre-mission banter was quieter, his eyes scanning the horizon instead of cracking jokes. The road narrowed into a stretch hemmed by low clay walls. David sat in the second vehicle, eyes moving from rooftops to windows to alleys, noting every shadow that didn't shift with the wind. The radio was alive with brief clipped updates from Sarah at the lead. Farid's voice floated from the back, murmuring into the comms with a local contact about recent movement in the area. They didn't see the IED until it went off. A wall of sound punched through the Humvee, lifting the front vehicle into the air before slamming it sideways in a cloud of dirt and flame. Shouts erupted over comms, overlapping orders and calls for medics. David was already moving, pack slung over one shoulder, boots hitting the ground hard. The air reeked of burning rubber and metal. The dust clung to his tongue like grit. He reached the blast site. Harris was dragging Bennett clear of the wreckage, coughing violently. The driver of the lead Humvee wasn't moving. David knelt beside him, checked for a pulse and found only stillness. He forced himself to focus on the living, moving to the next casualty without letting the loss take root. Gunfire cracked from an alley to their right. The team formed a defensive line, returning fire in short, controlled bursts. Mac was shouting for David to keep low as rounds chewed into the wall above them. Somewhere behind the noise, David heard it again, the soft, distinct cry of a child. He turned his head. She was there. Mary, robed in muted blue, the child in white against her shoulder, stood in the mouth of the alley as bullets tore past without touching her. The light around her seemed to dull the chaos, bending it away. Her eyes were fixed on him, calm and steady, like she knew exactly how this moment would end. For the briefest heartbeat, David felt that same deep, aching peace Amina had described. Peace without safety, peace that existed in spite of the danger. Then Mac's hand was on his shoulder, yanking him back behind cover. "Don't you dare freeze on me now!" David blinked and she was gone. The alley was just dust and shadow. He swallowed hard, reloaded a dropped magazine into his sidearm, and moved to cover Harris as they advanced to clear the threat. The fight was short but sharp. When it ended, the silence was thick, broken only by the low moans of the wounded and the crackle of a radio calling for medevac. 2 soldiers were down, one gone, one barely holding on. David worked on the latter, blood soaking through his gloves, while Mac kept watch. When the helicopters came, the team loaded the injured quickly, their faces set in that grim focus that left no space for words. David's muscles ached, his mouth dry as sand. He avoided meeting Mac's eyes, knowing the question would be there. Back at the base, Sarah read the casualty report aloud in the dim light of the ops tent. Her voice didn't waver, but the set of her jaw told David she was holding back more than she said. They all were. Later, sitting alone outside the barracks, David let the memory replay. Not just the sight of her, but the way her gaze seemed to pierce straight through him, stripping away every layer of fear and distraction. He didn't know if it was a message, a warning, or something else entirely. All he knew was that she kept finding him in the places death pressed closest, and each time she stayed longer. The flight home felt longer than the deployment itself. The roar of the C-17's engines was a steady wall of sound, a reminder that they were finally leaving the desert behind. David sat strapped into the webbed seat, duffel at his feet, his helmet balanced on his knees. Around him, soldiers dozed, read, or stared at nothing. Mac had his head tilted back, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, looking like sleep had finally caught him after months of playing hard to get. When they landed at Fort Hood, the air was thick with humidity, the Texas heat wrapping around David like a damp blanket. Families crowded the tarmac, waving flags and holding signs. A cheer rose when the soldiers marched in, but the sound hit David strangely. It felt both too loud and too far away. He searched the crowd for familiar faces and spotted his mother near the back, clutching a bouquet of sunflowers. She hugged him tightly, her voice catching when she said his name. His father stood beside her, a hand on his shoulder, grip firm but brief. The first days back blurred into a series of appointments, briefings, and gear returns. He turned in his rifle, cleaned out his locker, and signed stacks of paperwork with half-read instructions. People asked him how it was over there, but his answers stayed vague. Busy, hot, glad to be home. The truth felt too complicated to hand over in a casual conversation. Mac left 2 days later for Detroit, promising they'd meet up before too long. "Don't get too soft while I'm gone," he said, smirking in that way that was half joke, half order. With Mac gone, the quiet got louder. David tried sleeping in his old bed at his parents' house, but the stillness pressed on him like weight. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like distant gunfire. Every slam of a car door outside triggered a muscle-deep flinch. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, the image of Mary still as vivid as the day she first appeared. The VA intake process was as slow as he remembered. Forms, wait lists, and a rotating cast of nurses and clerks. That's when he met Dr. Rebecca Hayes, a psychiatrist with a calm voice and a way of looking at you like she actually wanted to hear the answer to her questions. "Tell me about your deployment," she said during their first session. He told her the basics, locations, duties, the kind of injuries he treated. She listened without interrupting, jotting down a few notes. When she asked if anything unusual had happened, he hesitated. "I saw something," he finally said. "Someone." Her pen paused. "Someone who wasn't supposed to be there." "You could say that." He almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. "A woman, blue robes, holding a child. She showed up during 2 different firefights. Bullets didn't touch her, and she wasn't afraid." Dr. Hayes didn't look skeptical, which surprised him. "Did you feel afraid when you saw her?" "No," he said, realizing it for the first time. "That's the weird part. I felt steady, like the noise didn't matter." She leaned back slightly. "Whether you believe she was real or not, what you felt in those moments matters. It tells us something about what you're holding on to and what might be holding on to you." He left the session with more questions than answers, but also with an appointment to come back the following week. That night, he walked down to the old pier at the edge of town. The Gulf's waves rolled in, slow and heavy, carrying the scent of salt and distant storms. He stood there a long time, listening to the water, thinking of the way Mary's eyes had met his in the middle of chaos. For the first time since returning, he didn't feel like he was standing on 2 separate worlds. The morning sun poured through the kitchen windows, catching the dust motes in slow, lazy spirals. David sat at the table, nursing a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm. His father was across from him, flipping through the newspaper with the slow precision of a man who believed breakfast should be quiet. "You're up early," his father said without looking up. "Couldn't sleep," David replied. He didn't mention the dream, the same one where the battlefield blurred into the Gulf shore, and Mary stood at the waterline, child in her arms, looking at him like she was waiting. His father folded the paper, set it down, and met his gaze. "Your mother says you've been distracted." "Just getting used to being back," David said, shrugging. "You've been back before. This feels different." David hesitated. "Yeah, it is." His father leaned forward, elbows on the table. "When I came home from Vietnam, I thought I was losing it, saw things I couldn't explain, heard things, but I didn't make the mistake of telling anyone official. You start talking about visions and you end up benched, labeled, or worse." "I'm not imagining it," David said, the edge in his voice sharper than he meant. Son, out there, your mind will do whatever it takes to keep you breathing. Sometimes that means showing you something that isn't there. David's jaw tightened. What if it is there? What if it's something you're meant to see? His father didn't answer right away. Then you'd better be sure before you go telling people, because once it's out, you can't take it back. The conversation ended there, the silence stretching uncomfortably until his mother bustled in with a grocery list in one hand and a kiss for David on the cheek. She looked between them, sensing the tension, but said nothing. Later, as his mother folded laundry in the living room, she asked quietly, "What's on your mind, David?" He considered brushing it off, but something in her tone made him stop. "Do you believe God still sends signs?" She set the towel aside and looked at him with eyes that had prayed over him for decades. "I believe he never stopped." He told her then about Mary on the battlefield, the child's cry, the peace that cut through the noise, about seeing her again during the IED attack, and about Amina's story. When he finished, his mother's expression was calm, almost relieved. "Then you've been given something rare. Don't dismiss it just because others might not understand." Her words settled into him like a warm ember, small but steady. That evening, his father knocked on his bedroom door. "I was hard on you this morning," he said. "Truth is, I'm not sure what I believe anymore, but I do know you've always had a good head, and if you think this means something, I'll back you. Just be careful." David nodded. "I will." The following Sunday, his mother convinced him to go to church. The building hadn't changed. White clapboard siding, a steeple that caught the morning light, and wooden pews that creaked under the weight of the congregation. The hymns were familiar, the sermon steady. But when the choir sang "Be Not Afraid," David felt his chest tighten, the words echoing too closely to what he'd felt when Mary looked at him. After the service, an older parishioner clasped his hand and thanked him for his service. "You must have seen some things over there," she said. He gave her the same vague answer he gave everyone. But as they walked to the car, he realized he no longer wanted to leave it at that forever. There was more to this than surviving a deployment. He just didn't know where the truth would take him. The train into Manhattan rattled along the tracks, the skyline slowly rising against a grey winter sky. David sat by the window, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, watching the city sharpen into towers and glass. He hadn't been to New York since basic training leave, and back then it was just noise, lights, and movement. This time, he was here for one reason: St. Patrick's Cathedral. Dr. Hayes had suggested it after their last session. "If you're looking for context," she'd said, "go somewhere steeped in the stories you're carrying." The cathedral loomed over Fifth Avenue, its spires like stone fingers against the clouds. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with incense. Candles flickered along the side aisles, their flames shifting with every passer-by. David walked slowly toward the front, his boots echoing on the marble floor, the vaulted ceiling stretching high above him. A priest stood near the altar, greeting visitors. He was in his 60s, with a lined face and kind eyes that seemed to notice more than they let on. "Welcome," he said. "I'm Father Michael." David hesitated, then said, "I need to talk to someone who won't think I'm crazy." Father Michael's smile was faint but genuine. "You've come to the right place. Walk with me." They moved to a quiet alcove near a statue of the Virgin Mary, the child in her arms carved in pale stone. David told him everything: the first sighting during the firefight, the second during the IED attack, the cry of the child that pierced through the chaos. He spoke of Amina's story, of the peace that came with the visions, and of how it all refused to fade from his mind. When he finished, Father Michael didn't speak right away. He looked at the statue for a long moment, then said, "Throughout history there have been accounts like yours. We call them Marian apparitions. Some are recognized by the Church after careful investigation. Others remain personal mysteries meant for the individual alone." David crossed his arms. "So, you think it's possible?" "I think it's possible you were given a sign. I also think it's possible you were given a mirror." "A mirror?" Father Michael nodded. "Sometimes what we see is a reflection of what's needed in us. Mary appears perhaps not because she changes the battlefield, but because she changes you on the battlefield." David shifted, uncomfortable with the idea. Then why me? That, Father Michael said, is the question only you can answer. The Church doesn't claim to understand why such things happen to one and not another, but the fact you're here means it's not something you can ignore. David let his gaze rest on the statue. The child's face was small, serene, untouched by fear. "Don't be afraid to let the experience change you," the priest said quietly. "And don't rush to label it. Some truths take time to speak." After lighting a candle, David stepped back into the noise of Fifth Avenue. The city's clamor felt almost alien after the stillness inside. He walked for blocks without noticing the cold, Father Michael's words replaying in his mind. A mirror. That evening in his hotel room, he took out the notebook. He wrote down every detail of both visions, the setting, the light, the sound of the child's cry. Then he added a question beneath it. If this is a mirror, what is it showing me? The page didn't answer, but writing it made the weight shift slightly, as if naming the question was the first step toward finding the shape of an answer. Back in Texas, the days fell into an uneven rhythm. David picked up a few shifts at a hardware store on Main Street, stocking shelves and helping customers choose the right screws or paint colors. It was simple work, but his mind rarely stayed on the task. He found himself scanning doorways and aisles the way he used to scan rooftops, a habit that refused to die. On weekends, he volunteered at the local clinic, running blood pressure checks and organizing donated supplies. The nurses were friendly, grateful for an extra set of capable hands. "You're wasted on a hardware store," one of them teased. "You should be back in Scrubs." He smiled politely, but didn't explain that Scrubs still smelled like desert dust and antiseptic in his mind. Even in the quiet, Mary kept finding him. He would catch her in the corner of his eye, a woman in muted blue sitting on a park bench, a child in her arms. But when he turned, it would be a mother with her toddler, or no one at all. It didn't feel like a hallucination. It felt like something layered over the world, visible only to him. One afternoon he was walking home from the store when a commotion outside the post office caught his attention. A man in his 70s had collapsed on the sidewalk, his wife kneeling beside him in panic. David rushed over, checked the man's airway, and began chest compressions. He didn't notice the gathering crowd, didn't hear the traffic slowing. His entire focus narrowed to the rhythm of his hands, the rise and fall of breath. When the paramedics arrived, they took over seamlessly. David stepped back, breathless, and in that moment, just beyond the ring of onlookers, he saw her. Mary. The same blue robes, the same white-clad child, watching quietly from the far side of the street. This time she didn't vanish immediately. She stood there for a full 5 seconds, her gaze fixed on him, before she turned and walked behind a delivery van. When he moved to follow, she was gone. That night, sleep was out of reach. He sat at his desk, the notebook open in front of him. Under the question he'd written in New York, "If this is a mirror, what is it showing me?" he added, "It's not just the battlefield, she's here too." The following week, Dr. Hayes noticed his distracted state. "You've seen her again," she guessed. He nodded. "In town, after helping a man who collapsed." Was she connected to the event? She was there, he said, unsure how else to put it. It felt the same, like she knew why she'd come. Dr. Hayes leaned forward. "What if these moments aren't random? What if she appears when you're doing what you're meant to do?" David thought about that for a long moment. "You mean helping people?" "I mean acting from the part of you that survives by giving others a chance to survive. On the battlefield here at home, it's the same instinct." Her words sat in him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward. In the weeks that followed, he started noticing smaller things. The relief in a stranger's eyes when he held a door, the way his mother's shoulders eased when he fixed a broken step on the porch without being asked, the quiet satisfaction in reorganizing the clinic's supply room so no one would waste time searching for gloves in an emergency. But every act carried an undercurrent, the thought that she might be there just out of sight, watching to see if he understood. One Saturday evening, walking home as the sun dipped behind the trees, he passed the park and saw a woman in blue seated under the oaks. For a moment his pulse jumped, but as he got closer, it was just a woman reading to her daughter, both laughing at something on the page. Still, he slowed, caught by the scene's quietness. It wasn't her, but it carried the same peace. And for once that was enough. The 4th of July came with a Texas sky so bright it seemed to hum. Families gathered along Main Street for the parade, kids chasing candy thrown from floats, the smell of barbecue drifting from park grills. David had agreed to go with his parents, partly to make his mother happy, partly to prove to himself that he could handle it. By sundown, the crowd had shifted to the park for the fireworks. People spread blankets on the grass, chatting over the hum of generators powering the concession stands. David sat near the edge of the crowd, hands resting loosely on his knees, eyes scanning without thinking. The first firework cracked open the night, a burst of red that painted the park in color. His chest tightened. Another exploded, white this time, and the sound slammed into him like incoming fire. His vision tunneled, the smell of smoke from the grills twisting into the stench of burning rubber and sand. The laughter of children warped into the wail of the wounded. He was back there. His breath quickened, hands curling into fists. The crowd was gone. In its place, dust and chaos. A Humvee burning, Mac shouting his name. And there, Mary, holding the child, calm as ever. She was closer this time, no more than 10 feet away. Her lips moved, but the sound was swallowed by the roar in his ears. A hand gripped his shoulder hard. "David!" He blinked and saw Mac, older now, out of uniform, a faded tiger's cap on his head. "Hey, you with me?" The noise of the park rushed back in, fireworks booming, people cheering. David realized he was standing, tense and ready to run. Mac guided him away from the crowd, toward the quiet near the baseball diamond. "Breathe, man! In! Out!" David followed the rhythm, the edge slowly receding, sweat slicked his palms. "Guess I picked the right night to visit," Mac said, trying for a smile. "You looked ready to tear through the crowd like we were back in Kandahar." David sat on the low bleachers, staring at the dark outfield. "I saw her again." Mac's smirk faded. "Mary?" He nodded. She was right there. And it felt like she was trying to say something this time. "Did you hear it?" "No, just saw her lips move." Mac leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Maybe you need to stop waiting for her to explain it. Maybe you figure out what you're supposed to do without her spelling it out." David shook his head. "What if I get it wrong?" "What if you don't?" Mac countered. "You've been given something that pulls you out of yourself in the middle of hell. Whatever it is, use it. Waiting for a perfect answer will just keep you stuck." The last firework faded into the night, leaving only the faint smell of sulfur in the air. The park began to empty, parents herding tired kids toward minivans. Back at his parents' house, David stood in the kitchen, still keyed up. His mother was rinsing dishes. "You left early," she said gently. "Too loud," he answered. He didn't add the rest, that in the middle of the noise, he'd felt closer to her presence than he had in weeks. That night, lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling fan turning slow circles. He thought about Amina's words, peace, not safety, about Father Michael's idea of a mirror, about Mac's challenge to stop waiting. When sleep finally came, it carried him into a dream of a long road stretching into the desert. Mary stood at the far end, the child in her arms. This time she wasn't just watching, she was walking toward him. The dream stayed with him, sharper than any he'd had before. By morning, David knew he couldn't keep circling the same questions in the same small town. He packed a duffel, told his parents he was taking some time to sort things out, and hit the road in his pickup. No fixed destination, just a list of places he felt pulled toward. First stop was the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Angel Fire, New Mexico. The wind there was thin and cool, carrying the scent of pine. He walked the quiet grounds, reading the names etched in stone, feeling the weight of lives lived and lost before his time. He thought of his father, of what he'd said about seeing things you couldn't talk about. From there, he drove east to Oklahoma City, to the bombing memorial. Chairs of bronze and glass stood in neat rows on the grass, each one lit softly from within. He sat there at dusk, watching as the lights grew stronger in the dark, thinking about the way absence could still speak. In Kansas, he met an old Marine named Phil at a small-town diner. Phil had done 2 tours in Iraq, and over coffee he mentioned, almost casually, that he'd once seen a woman standing in the middle of a firefight like she had no business being there. David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. What did she look like? Phil squinted as if pulling the memory from a far shelf. Blue dress, maybe grey. Long hair, didn't move, didn't get hit. My buddy saw her too, but we never talked about it after. Why not? Phil stirred his coffee. Some things feel too big for words, or maybe too personal. I just know I left that fight alive, and I think she had something to do with it. David carried those words with him to his next stop, Washington, D.C. Arlington National Cemetery, spread before him like an ocean of white markers. He walked among them slowly, the crunch of gravel under his boots the only sound. Near a cluster of trees, he stopped to rest on a low bench. That's when he saw her. Mary stood between 2 rows of markers, the child in her arms. This time, the air didn't shimmer. There was no battlefield noise, no chaos. Just the stillness of that sacred ground and the faint rustle of leaves. Her eyes met his. For the first time, David didn't feel startled. He stood and walked toward her. The distance seemed to stretch and bend, but he kept moving until he was only a few steps away. The child's small hand reached out from the folds of white cloth. Mary looked down at him, then back at David. No words passed, but the peace that radiated from her was so complete it brought tears to his eyes. Then she was gone. David stood there a long time, staring at the empty space between the markers. Finally, he sat back on the bench and wrote in his notebook, "She comes where the living and the dead meet." Before leaving D.C., he visited the World War II memorial, running his fingers along the carved stone. He realized he wasn't chasing her anymore, not in the same way. Each place he visited left him with a clearer sense of connection, as if the path wasn't about the visions themselves, but about what they were pointing him toward. On the long drive home, he replayed the journey, the memorials, Phil's story, Arlington. The image of Mary in that field of markers stayed in his mind, not as a haunting, but as a steady anchor. He didn't know exactly what the next step was, but for the first time, he felt ready to take it. The decision to return to Afghanistan came quietly, like a tide he didn't notice until it was already pulling him. David signed on with a non-profit that provided medical aid in conflict zones, knowing full well where they were sending him. He told his parents it was just a short contract, but his mother's eyes said she understood it was more than that. Mac shook his head, but clapped him on the shoulder. "If this is what you need to do, don't come back with regrets," he said. Kandahar looked different and exactly the same. New buildings had sprung up in some places, but the smell of dust, diesel, and distant cooking fires was unchanged. The organization's compound was modest, a few low buildings, a small clinic, a storage shed. From the moment he stepped inside, David fell back into the rhythm of triage, stitches, and logistics. It felt familiar, almost too familiar. Weeks passed with no sign of her. He began to wonder if she had only come in the crucible of battle, and maybe this wasn't the place or the time anymore. Then, one late afternoon, the sound of gunfire cracked through the clinic walls. A skirmish had broken out nearby, and wounded were already being rushed in. David's hands worked without hesitation, packing wounds, starting IVs, shouting instructions to the local nurses. The air was thick with blood, sweat, and urgency. A boy no older than 12 was carried in, shrapnel lodged in his side. As David leaned over him, the noise around him shifted. He looked up. Mary stood in the open doorway, framed by the sun. The child in her arms was the same as always, his tiny face turned toward David, but this time Mary's lips moved again, and he heard her. "Be what you were made to be." The words weren't loud, they didn't need to be. They sank into him like they'd been waiting for a place to land. In that moment, everything made sense. Not the why of her choosing him, but the what she'd been pointing to all along. It wasn't about war or peace, about visions or proof. It was about using the steadiness she brought him to give it to others, wherever they were, whatever the cost. He nodded, barely, but enough. The moment broke, and she was gone. The noise of the clinic roared back in, and David refocused on the boy, his movements sharper, more certain than before. By nightfall, the wounded were stable or transferred. The compound was quiet again, save for the distant hum of a generator. David sat outside, the desert sky spread above him, feeling the words replay in his mind. Mac had been right back on that July night. She wasn't going to hand him a manual. But she'd given him something better, a directive he could carry into every corner of his life, regardless of whether she ever appeared again. The next morning he sent an email to Dr. Hayes. "I think I understand now. It's not about her showing up. It's about me showing up." When David returned to Texas for good, the air smelled like rain on warm pavement. He stepped off the bus with nothing but his duffel and the quiet certainty of what came next. There were no speeches, no flags, just the sound of tires on the highway and the faint hum of cicadas in the distance. Within a month, he'd rented a small brick building on the edge of town, one that had been a feed store years ago. He stripped it down to the bones, repainted the walls and filled it with donated medical supplies, folding chairs, and a long wooden table. Above the door, a simple sign read, "Haven House, for veterans and families." Word spread quickly. Some came for medical checkups, others for counseling sessions. A few just needed a place to sit with people who understood. David worked every role: medic, listener, fixer of leaky faucets. He partnered with a local church and a few non-profits to provide meals, job training and transportation. On the opening day, Mac showed up with a box of coffee and a grin. "Not bad, Lawson. You've built yourself a mission without the bullets." Dr. Hayes came too, hugging him like a proud sister. "This is it," she whispered. "This is you showing up." David didn't tell them that in the week since coming home, he'd caught glimpses of her, Mary, more than once. Never in the middle of chaos now, but in moments of quiet connection. A veteran laughing with his daughter, a widow lighting a candle in the corner of the room, a young man finding the courage to tell his story for the first time. Each time, the sense of peace was the same. One evening, as the sun sank low and the last visitor left, David stood in the doorway of Haven House. The street was empty, bathed in the golden light that made even the cracked sidewalk look almost holy. Across the street, leaning against the lamppost, she was there. Mary. The child rested quietly in her arms, eyes half closed. She didn't speak this time. She didn't need to. Her gaze held his, and the weight of it was both grounding and freeing. David felt the corners of his mouth lift in the smallest of smiles. Then she turned and walked away, fading into the glow of the setting sun. He didn't follow. That night, he sat at his desk with the old notebook. On the final page, under the first words he'd ever written, "I saw her," he added, "I understand now." Haven House became more than a building. It was a living thing, shaped by the people who found their way through its door. Some stayed only an afternoon, others came back every week. Each left a mark, and each carried a piece of what they found there into the rest of their lives. David knew the visions might come again, or they might not. But the mission was the same either way. Be steady where others faltered. Be present where others might turn away. He'd learned that peace wasn't the absence of danger. It was the anchor that held when danger came. If you've been with me through this story, you know it's more than one man's account. It's a reminder that sometimes we're given moments that shift the course of our lives, and it's on us to decide what we'll do with them. If David's journey has resonated with you, make sure you subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Because the world is full of quiet miracles like this one, waiting to be told. And before you go, click the video now appearing on your screen for another powerful true story that will stay with you long after it's over.